Hi again, all you Uinta friends. It's with great pleasure that I end the summer season by taking you all on a tour all around Utah's greatest wilderness and introduce to the world all my 75 new Uinta friends, all seen through a summary of my 5 trips into the heart of the Uintas. And I have to say, against all odds, as 6 months ago it looked like I was a cripple in my 78th year, never to hike again, much less backpack in my Uinta wilderness. I'll mention some details about that in just a moment. From the beginning Google Earth view of the high Uintas, we've now moved over to a road map because we're now going to begin the 500-mile tour, which actually ended up being more like 1,000. But we began the summer season in May, actually, in Camas, Utah, as I was driving to Piedmont, the Piedmont ghost town in southern Wyoming, to spend time at the cemetery to hopefully meet some of the people that are descendants of the people from Piedmont. Along the way, of course, you do see some interesting sights like the Muddy Creek camp and crossing of the Mormon pioneers, and then you come to Piedmont. In the high desert country of southern Wyoming, and the 3 charcoal kilns, now with a nice display there that explains. But there's the cemetery up on the hill that I noticed a number of years ago when I first visited there, and I noticed that it was an active cemetery with a Craig Byrne Crompton buried there in 1998. And so I thought, well, if I camp out there on Memorial Day, I should meet somebody from there, living or dead. And so there I was, and I did meet one of the living descendants, Kelly Crompton Bucio, and had a wonderful talk with her. It's her husband was buried there in 1996 after an airplane accident in which she was also injured. And then it was later a brother of her husband who was buried there in 98. So she's my first Uinta friend this year. And then there's JD, her husband, JD Bucio. And then because of them, I was able to visit in Orem, Utah, the matriarch of the Byrne family, Moses Byrne, who established Piedmont in 1854. And so there I visited with Faye Crompton and her husband, and got some wonderful pictures of artists' drawings and whatnot of Piedmont, and learned firsthand from her because she actually lived there in Piedmont until she graduated from high school. Now we're on to the first the backpacking portion of this program, and you'll recall that I was having a really difficult time a year and a half ago, and needed back surgery to solve a problem that I was having with my left leg, which was making me a cripple. So I had a number of YouTube videos on with the comeback theme for my 78th year, and showed all kinds of things along the Wasatch Front where I was working out. And eventually I came to one where I said, well, what you got to do, you got to fake not being a cripple. And so there was one video for that. But in admitting entitling it that, I was actually admitting being a cripple. And so it just really looked like I was not going to be able to backpack any longer. And I'm grateful for all those who followed along. I eventually had, it was discovered that I was bone on bone on my left hip, and so I had hip replacement surgery. And after that, I can say now that for the first time in 30 years, I'm without pain. And so I was able to do 100 miles of backpacking against all odds in the high Uintas this past summer. And it began with a trip up into the Granddaddy Basin. There was one lake that I always failed getting to, and that was Palisades, and I wanted to pick that one up and add it to my list. And on that trip, I met whole bunch of new Uinta friends, beginning with Sam and Dan Fisher, and then up the trail Bill Christie and Marion Mills, And then a little further along, I met Mike Slater and his whole family coming down the trail. And then up in the basin, I met John Maynard, and then Ken, who worked for the Forest Service. And then as I was coming out from Palisades Lake, I met Hillary Bean and her class from the University of Utah. And then a little bit down the trail, I met the other half of the group, led by Mike Packard, son of my original backpacking buddy, Ted Packard. And so there's a whole bunch of new high Uinta friends. And then down near the trailhead, I met this wonderful couple, the Whitings. But I did make it to Palisades Lake, and so that's one thing I failed at in the past, but I've done it now. Then I was on to Hannah to get something to eat at the country store, but next door is the museum, created by Snooks Roberts, and I have his book, and I knew about him, and I've always meant to go there to see this unique museum that has the only bootlegger still west of the Mississippi. But I found that I knocked on the door, and it was Tracy who answered, and she said her husband Snooks died last year in his 98th year, and she's 93, but she was kind enough to show me the museum, which is just incredible, and found that she's daughter of famous and legendary folk hero Frank DeFay, one of the originals, and learned some incredible new information about Frank and his exploits, and about Snooks, and then about Tracy. And so you shouldn't miss that museum there in Hannah, Utah, right next to the store. Down the road you can see Tabby Mountain, and named after Chief Tabby, and then there's Tabiona, named after him also. And so I took a little tour of Tabiona. Unique place with a school that has all the grades in it, and nice houses, and an LDS chapel. And then of course there's my cabin, the cabin that I dreamed about when I was a young kid. And then I drove down to Duchesne, going through all this ranch country where they're working hard putting up hay to feed their cattle during the winter time, and some beautiful cattle, and ranch homes with kids playing on the trampoline. And then further down, oil developments, and there's the river, and then we get to Duchesne, which you see here on the map. And here's the Duchesne River in midsummer this year, and then here you see it midsummer in 2011. Vast differences. And then I went to the Forest Service ranger station there, and I met new Uinta friend Patricia. And then up the road, there's a monument to some of the first white people that saw the Uintas, Father Escalante and Dominguez, who in 1776 came through the Uinta Basin. Of course, I am learning that there were Spaniards in the area much earlier than that, and I'll include that in the book that I write. Then it was time for the next backpacking trip up Middle Fork of Black's Fork. Wonderful place that I've been several times, and where I first where my interest was first sparked in the tie hackers that I'll mention in just a minute. Up there, there's a cross and a monument, I guess we can call it, to a lover of the mountains, Sam Gallegos, and so I'll consider him one of my high Uinta friends too, who's on the other side. And then coming down the trail, I met Nicole and Mark Monroe, who had also been up to Bob's Lake as I had. But on that trip, I achieved my goal of mapping the whole area with 14 different tie hacker sites, concluding that it was probably a Swedish community of tie hackers. Then to Evanston, with the rainbow over my unit that indicated that I was going to have some good luck. And so I was over at the library, as I have been many times. And there, Noni, a prophet, is a good friend, and who's told me about her little sister who built a model of the Hilliard flume, and then it was out at the Bear River State Park. And so I went out there, and I met Kendra Cagle, and she showed me where it was, and then of course I have pictures of that on one of my YouTube videos from the summer about the Hilliard flume. And then I was on to the ranger station in Evanston, and I met Ambera, who I had met years ago, 5 years ago, up at the Bear River Ranger Station. But in Evanston there, I met and had a very, very wonderful visit with Bernard Acey, the trail and wilderness manager for the Forest Service in that area. And then I was back up to the Bear River Ranger Station, and I met Becca, or Rebecca Laird, and I mentioned her on YouTube videos during the summer too. For details of all this, you got to go to my other 6 YouTube videos for the summer. But from there, I went up searching for the Mill City ghost town where the Hilliard flume originated, and eventually during the summer, I was able to come up with some remnants of the Hilliard flume, which all of the books say nothing exists anymore. But here you can see a support structure and some of the 80 tons of square nails that were used to put together the flume. To understand that, of course, once again, you got to go to my YouTube video on the Hilliard flume, and there's several of them. Becca had suggested that I go to the museum in Evanston, so I was back to Evanston, and I met Kay Rossiter. Went through the wonderful museum there in Evanston, and then Kay, she gave me a lot of information about the tie hackers, and then invited me to be the speaker at their August 1st meeting of the Wyoming Historical Society there in Evanston. And you'll get a little bit of that speech in just a few minutes. From there, I was on to Mountain View, another of the gateways to the Uintas, and dropped in the library to say hello to Stephanie, who's helped me. She was probably the first one that helped me in my research and about the tie hackers. Then on to the Forest Service office, where I've also got copies of all kinds of publications and reports and information about the tie hackers. And there is an actual tie hacker cabin reconstructed there. From there, I headed east to visit the museum in Lyman, and there I got more information. Got a lot of photocopies of information out of several books. By this time, of course, I needed to wash my clothes, and so pioneer style, I did so. And then I was on my way back to Utah because I didn't get all the information I needed about the Uintas in Summit County, and so I went to Colville, the county seat, and there I met Navi Vernon, and she was preparing me materials and said, go down and see the museum while I'm getting this stuff ready. And so you'll miss it if you don't know any better. It looks like the broom closet, but that's the entrance to the museum. You go down some narrow little stairs down into the basement, and it's just an incredible museum that nobody should miss. It's worth a special trip to Colville just to see that. Then I was back to Salt Lake. I needed some maps, and went to REI for them, and I met there Wayne and Susie Gregory. He's the originator and inventor of the Gregory packs, and so we had a wonderful talk, and they're new High Uinta friends, as are all the people that you see in this program. Then it was time for me to tackle Crow Basin. I had failed at getting down into Crow Basin 2 years ago. I got to the edge and I could see it, but I didn't have the confidence. I was hurting too bad, too much pain, and I just didn't think that I would be able to get back out of there. And so but now I was ready for it, and so I headed for Crow Basin, stopped along the way at this little store, Pin Willie's, and met Julie Nelson, another new High Uinta friend, and learned that the little store is also a museum, even with an old artificial leg of a customer that didn't want it buried with her. So there's interesting, fascinating stuff in all these little stores. They're museums as well as stores. But then on to Crow Basin, and I did this in honor of my great-great-grandmother, Alice Brooks, of the Martin Handcart Company, and it was because of her toughness and the toughness of the pioneers that I was tough enough to get down into Crow Basin. And once down in there, I met Darren and Ryan McMichael and Tom and Tyler Summerhays. They have been following my website for a number of years, and they knew that I was going to be in Crow Basin, and so they whipped together a trip for Crow Basin too. And so we met there at Crow Lake in Crow Basin. So I did make it to Crow Lake and caught some wonderful fish there, native cutthroat trout. Next, I was back to Evanston, Wyoming again for the 1st of August to give the speech that they had invited me to give, which I entitled The Tie Hackers, Unsung American Heroes Without Whom the West Might Not Have Been Won. And so I'll now play for you about 8 minutes summary excerpts from that speech. Thank you, Kay. Appreciate that. And it is wonderful and surprising, I'll have to say, to be here. I think I better just say just a word or two about what led up to me actually being here. When I was 16 years old, we moved from California to Utah. I had never been backpacking in my life. I didn't know what the high Uinta were, but a bunch of my buddies that summer all of a sudden said, "Hey, let's go backpacking up in the Uintas for the fish opener." It was the high Uinta's primitive area back at that time. And so we got off our work on Friday afternoon, drove up over Wolf Creek Pass, and then we hiked all night up Hades Canyon to get to what we call the Granddaddies, the Granddaddy Basin. Granddaddy Lake is actually the largest lake in the high Uinta wilderness. But we didn't know what we were doing. I didn't, at least. But, you know, we were carrying a watermelon, and we had Irish root beer in glass bottles, quarts of it, you know, pork and beans, and obviously in cans. And it was tough. In fact, 3 out of the 6 of us on that trip decided they would never, ever go backpacking again. There were 3 of us that got hooked on it for some reason. And so we started learning about backpacking some, and eventually backpacked all across the Uinta, the primitive area at that time. But I realized, hey, we're seeing just a little bit of it. Before I end this life, I have got to explore, photograph, and report on the entire area. Well, but then I got diverted. I decided I had to go off to Central America, Guatemala in particular, to work with the Mayan Indians. Prepared, packed up, and then an elderly neighbor came out to say goodbye. She said, "I'll give you 6 months and you'll come running home with your tail between your legs." And I thought, I will die before I give her satisfaction. Well, eventually I came running home with my tail between my legs, but it was 37 years later, in 2002. And moved to Springville, Utah, and then I thought, okay, now what do? I did have 5 kids that I was the mother and father to, that I was trying to raise by myself, but they were getting up, you know, big enough so they could be all right by themselves for a few weeks at a time. And so I started what I called the High Uinta Wilderness Project. And I had actually prepared for this for years in Guatemala on my farm by walking around my farm 2 or 3 times a week, 3 or 4 miles with a 100-pound bag of fertilizer on my back. And so when I took off in 2003 on what I called my 27-day expedition, and it was a no resupply trip, I started with 83 pounds on my back. I was able to handle it because I prepared for years to do it. That expedition was basically along the spine of the Uintas. And then I realized, okay, now I've got to start coming up the drainages on the north and on the south. And as I was doing it on the north, I started noticing ruins of cabins. I thought, well, they're the pioneers, or they were the mountain men, Jedediah Smith maybe, or, you know, and so but then I made one trip up Middle Fork of Black's Fork, which was just a big empty spot on the map. And I noticed that nobody had been up there ahead of me that year, and it didn't look like anybody had been up there ahead of me the year before either. I was in virgin country, it seemed like, and I was heading for a lake, Bob's Lake. It was up above Timberline. That was the kind of thing that attracted me, something that was isolated, something that very little visited. So that was my objective. But as I went up through the drainage, I noticed cabin after cabin after cabin. And in one of my photo essays on my website, I said exactly what the heck was going on up here. Well, I'll have to admit right now, I was one of those low information backpackers. You know, I was backpacking, doing a pretty good job, but I didn't know anything about the history of where I was going through. And I met Bob and Teresa Fasinelli. And we got talking about everything, and she was a wilderness ranger for the summer. She'd go on horseback. And then just sort of as an afterthought, as I was leaving, I said, hey, would you guys happen to know what the heck was going on up Middle Fork of Black's Fork with all these ruins? Because I saw more ruins up there than I'd seen anywhere. And so she opened this whole vision to me, this new word, this new terminology, which Utahns don't know anything about, tie hackers. The old period was 1867 to about 1880, when Irish lumbermen were sent into the north slope of the Uinta Mountains to work 12 months a year with their broadaxes, making by hand railroad ties. Millions of them. And up there, I learned that they would work mostly in the wintertime, where they could use sleds to haul them down to certain points in the drainage where they would build splash dams and then accumulate these railroad ties behind the splash dams. The runoff would come in the spring, it would fill up, they'd blow with dynamite, and down into Wyoming would come the railroad ties. And of course they had to follow them, the tie hackers had to follow them to keep them from snagging and jamming and whatnot. And so I started learning about all these river runs of railroad ties. Now, that was the old period. After all was said and done, I changed the map. I added on all the places which I had found and discovered and learned about, but which are not on the Forest Service map. Eventually they've got to come up with a new map. And you can, the ones that are Forest Service are the ones highlighted by yellow, and then there's all these others, which has been a fascinating journey for me to overcome this being a low information backpacker. Asked me a question. She said, how was it? Do you have any artifacts? And I probably said I don't really, did I say I didn't have any? I can't remember what I answered, but I didn't really have much. And so what I did this morning, I did my hour of jogging along the railroad tracks this morning. Union Pacific Railroad. And so I have some artifacts now. This is an old piece of wood, and it's just got to be from the tie hackers. If you want to carbon date it to prove me wrong, you go ahead. But there's something.
So there's 8 minutes of the hour-long speech and question and answer period. From the speech, I acquired a whole bunch of new high Uinta friends, but I didn't get pictures of them. But I did of Sean Moore, who I had some wonderful visits with and learned a lot. From there, I headed south to the north slope of the high Uintas, going to the east fork of Black's Fork trailhead, where I had my trip up Little East Fork of Black's Fork, a place that I had tried to get to a few years ago, but once again I failed. Well, I wasn't about to fail this year, and so I went up there in part to give Bigfoot one last chance to find me, so I could take his family portrait. But this is a wonderful area, and up as I was into the pretty high country, approaching the pass, I met another high winter friend, Teodoro Sanguino, a Chilean sheep herder, who was on his way out to get provisions for his camp that was over in the Uinta drainage on the other side of the pass. And then, as I was coming back down, I all of a sudden, crashing through the trees, it just kind of took me by surprise, and it seemed like some giant coming at me. First thought, Bigfoot, but he had a red T-shirt on, and then I was back to reality, and of course I discovered that it was Rob Wilcox, a mountain runner, who was on his way up to the pass. And I told him about a big personal experience I'd had with Bigfoot. You'll have to go to my YouTube video about that to get the details. Talked about Bigfoot, and he said, well, maybe so, And later he came by my camp, and I asked him how far he had made it, and he said made it all the way. Later on down the trail, I met Mike Atkinson with his whole family, extended family, and found that he kind of knew about me from my website, and so there he is with Littlefoot. And his son-in-law, Aaron Cooper, who had a big load because all the kids, had to help them with their stuff. And there Mike is with his daughter Jen, and there's Lisa, his daughter, and Aaron's wife, and a couple of the kids. And there were more in the group, but I didn't get pictures of them. Then down the trail a little ways, I met the Hardys and had a nice talk with them. And so on this trip, I made it to Squaw Pass that I had never done before, and so I achieved something that I had before failed at, and I got to Porcupine Lake and had some wonderful fishing that I had always kind of missed before, but caught some of those colorful brook trout of my whole experience. Then back to Mountain View, and then going along the Uintas, the north slope of the Uintas, I came to Lone Tree, where you cross the Henry's Fork, and you're in the Henry's Fork drainage all the way down to Flaming Gorge Reservoir. You first come to Lone Tree. Of course, you see beautiful cattle along the way, and there's a little store that has been closed since 1986, I believe it is, and so the parking meter hasn't been used too much recently. You can see that by the cobwebs on it. There you can see the Hickey Ranch to the north, and soon I, just by chance, met this wonderful guy, Joe Hickey, who's just a walking encyclopedia of history, and his brother Mike. And I've, after some wonderful conversations that I videoed, was invited to an outdoor lecture on the Indian culture. And there Mike is pointing to the tree after which Lone Tree is named. It's a cottonwood, kind of smallish, but it's pretty old. It's been hit by lightning 5 times and survived. But the lecture was about the Indian culture, and also you see here the gun type of rifle used by Custer at his last stand. Met Marie Wilkinson, and all these wonderful people many of them were LDS missionaries at various LDS historic sites in southern Wyoming. And so it was wonderful to learn more about the Indian culture. Then I was back to Fort Bridger to the annual Mountain Man Rendezvous that's held on the Bikes Fork that comes out of the Uintas. That's where Wilford Woodruff began and was the first one to introduce fly fishing into the West. But Fort Bridger, with a population of 345, swells during this period. 50,000 visitors is estimated come to this wonderful rendezvous. Here you see Jim Bridger. You can stop and read about the mountain men if you'd like. But there are people that come dressed as Indians and as mountain men. And of course there's the lawmen, and then the mountain men version of the piñata is they load up their cannons and they fire away, and the kids scramble for the candy. And there I attended a very fascinating lecture by archaeologist Dudley Gardner, who talked about the excavation they're doing there, and all
many aspects of the history of Fort Bridger and of the Indian culture of the area. Mike, of course, very intent listening to Dudley Gardner. So we're back to Lone Tree now and heading east along the Uintas, seeing many fascinating sights. Of course, most of the people you see on the highway are going to or coming from Flaming Gorge. But along the way, I found in Lone Tree a little cemetery and visited and photographed all of the tombstones. Some of them were from pioneer the period, 1837. There were some that were unmarked, and I'm trying to learn more about this that I'll fill in the details later. But on down through the Henry's Fork drainage, you come to the sign that talks about the first mountain men rendezvous in 1825 held on the Henry's Fork. It comes out of the Uintas, as I say, and I sought the exact spot where this rendezvous was held, so I drove down a ways and then took off on a side road that crosses the Henry's Fork River, and as close as I can see, it was probably on the Anderson Ranch. And it was, you can see on the map here the spot on the right there, but this spot was chosen because of abundant grass, and you can see it, the lush pasture and hay fields along there, and of course the wildlife, beautiful antelope. Then I was proceeded down towards Manila. This is one little crossroads along the way where there is the only store between Mountain View and Manila, but it was closed, and so I kept going down the road towards McKinnon. McKinnon is a very nice little community, very small, of course, with a lot of old buildings and some new, beautiful modern ranches, and with a school that has all the grades in it, and a Mormon chapel, the only church building between the Mountain View and Manila, guarded by a cattle guard, the parking lot. Very interesting. Then we come to Utah, and you can see the difference. Wow, Utah is one great place, don't you think? And then we come to Manila, which is near Flaming Gorge. And there I went to the Forest Service office, and I met Joellen Reardon, who helped me with a lot of good material and information. And then Maddie Woodward, or Madeline is her real name, and she provided me with some pictures of Bigfoot footprints. She said they were about 15 inches long. She found near there. And then you come to Flaming Gorge, but we're not going to get into Flaming Gorge here. That's a whole new can of worms, but of course you can stop and read that, and we'll get to that later on a new project. Back to Wyoming and back to that crossroads where the Spirit Lake Sheep Creek Scenic Byway begins. And you can see it there on the map. And that Nyla's store this time was open, and I met Nyla Wild, originally from Idaho, but married someone from there, and she'd been there for 47 years. And this is her ranch, and quite a gal that has her store open. It's the only store between Mountain View and Manila. But then we go on this scenic byway that you see up there in the top left of the picture. They're zooming in on it, and here is another picture of it on a different map. It starts as you get to the Utah line. It all of a sudden it becomes a paved road, and it's paved for 4 miles, and then all of a sudden it turns into dirt. But it's a good, well-graded road that you see here in these pictures. As we go along, going now east with the Uintas, the peaks in the Uintas covered with clouds and herds of cattle, and then this is Long's Park Reservoir, I believe. Beautiful sights along the way. And then you come to Sheep Creek, a crossing there, and this is where the Carter Military Road comes in, and for a ways follows the scenic byway. This is a fascinating story in itself. This is the route actually used by most by the Indians to cross the Uintas anciently, and then they built this Carter Military Road to connect the military installations in the Uinta Basin with those in Wyoming. But as you go along, you come to a road that goes to Brown Lake, and it's just a little ways down there near the creek where you find a marker that for the military road, 1881 to 84. We then keep heading east, and you look south, and you see the last two peaks of the Uintas. You see Mount Underman on the right, 12,078 feet, and Lady Peak at 12,028 feet, which at its eastern edge, that's where the Highline Trail ends, and from there on the terrain goes down. Eventually you get to Sheep Creek Geological Loop, which is a real worthwhile experience, and that could be a YouTube video all by itself, and it will be one day. But there you eventually get back to the main highway, come to the road that turns off to Flaming Gorge and Dutch John and points up in Wyoming. From there is 35 miles to Vernal, and you go over this summit, 8,428 feet, and compare that to a pass on the western end, which is Bald Mountain Pass, 10,759 feet. So we're about 2,300 feet lower on the eastern end of the Uintas, and so there it flattens out and goes east toward Diamond Mountain and down to the Green River. But here we are dropping down into Vernal, where I went to the Forest Service office and had a wonderful visit with two Forest Service archaeologists, Jeff Rust and Tara Hamilton, and they gave me some wonderful information that I've got to work hard at digesting concerning the Indian culture on the southern slope of the Uintas. They did give me one of the original maps of the area from 1874. But then I went to the Western Heritage Museum and took a few shots, a whole bunch actually, but I'll just show you a few here, of the Indian culture anciently before the white men on the southern slope of the Uintas. And so there's just a few shots here. We'll get into that more when I write the book. They did have cultivate corn, and so there's so here's some of the stone grinding apparatuses they used, and they're brought to mind the white men's effort to culturize the Indians, taking the kids away and taking their native costumes and their language and trying to destroy their religion. And it didn't work too good. But I learned more about the word Uinta. Uinta, without the H, is the correct spelling of the word that means pine forest. And so there you can read about the technicalities of it. But there is I was back to Duchesne from Vernal, and I said goodbye to Sheila and Lori there in the ranger station, and I was on my way back to the Wasatch Front, completing the 500-mile loop around the Uinta Mountains. Now, what of course I'm missing is something further east, because the Uintas kind of drop off and actually end a little bit over the Colorado line in what is called Brown's Hole. And this is the Outlaw Trail, part of the Outlaw Trail that I've got to will be reporting on too. Fascinating, you know, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and all those good guys. And then of course there's a Dinosaur National Monument, which is also on the fringes of the Uinta Range. And so that's the tour of the not just the High Uinta Wilderness, but of the High Uinta Mountain Range. Very unique, and I'm so grateful that I was able to do so much during the summer. When 6 months ago I was a cripple, and all of a sudden that was lifted from me. And of course, yeah, I was an old guy, you know, I got tired and all that stuff, but hey, I was able to do much. Well, everything I did was something that I didn't think that I was going to be able to do, and so it was against all odds, and I'm extremely grateful for this wonderful opportunity to do it and to share it with all of you.